Alright, as we move into Rhino, I wanted to record a video just to kind of double back on some of the things we looked at today in class. So this should be a little bit quicker of a walkthrough, but let's first look at the project statement, right? So here on Owlbox, I encourage everyone to go on and read through this. In the exercise, you can explains exactly the steps needed to move forward. The big thing is this. We're kind of going to go back to the base image. We're going to use that through a process of Illustrator to Rhino. Rhino will then create a drawing, and ultimately we'll make some transformations in Rhino, sending it back to Illustrator. The other thing to know is that this is done at 8 inches by 8 inches, not 4 by 4, so we need to increase our artboard and scale our artwork. So here you go, you're going to scale it by 200%. And you're going to export each as a DXF file, so that way we can kind of import that into Rhinoceros. So read through the steps, kind of line by line, and follow this process. But let's go back and look under the presentation files. Here's part 3 example. And this is exactly what we're looking for. So here is the kind of baseline file that's been turned into trace, image trace, right? So it's just a black and white image. It's simple. It doesn't have all the transformations in it. We take that into Rhino and we create this line drawing. This has actually been sent back to Illustrator. And then using that, we can take your permutations, the things that you've made with the layered image trace, and create new versions of that in Rhinoceros. And so here you can see this is a Rhino drawing sent back to Illustrator. And while these transformations were done initially in Illustrator, we're doing a similar series of transformations in Rhino, but Rhino gives us an ability to really play up and play with the line work. So to do that, I'm going to download first this export CS6 AI file. This is a AI file which is for Illustrator. It's this file here. It's a simple one for us because it's already 8 inches by 8 inches. Let's go to the workspace, and we're already in Classic. If I go to Document Setup, I can go to Edit Artboards, and here in the artboard I see it's 8 inches by 8 inches. If yours was already 4 by 4, there it's there, right? So we'd want to take all of this stuff, and we want to go to Object, Transform, Scale, and go 50% the size. We're doing the opposite of this, right? So we're going from a 4 by 4, document setup, edit artboard. We're going to make it now an 8 inch by 8 inch. Then everything inside of here, we're going to object, transform, scale, and make this 200% so that it's now filling that 8 inch by 8 inch size. The one you'll see here is that we have some fill with gray, some fill with black, and we do have a border. And really, if you wanted to go into Illustrator and look at the layers, we know that this is already a transformation, right? This is the base image itself, and in Illustrator, we can organize things onto different layers. So for this example, I'm going to go back to kind of the root right here. I'm actually going to get rid of the border entirely. We can look at how to draw that in Rhino, and I'm only going to export the base simple image. So I'll go File, Export. I'm going to export as, and now I need to find a location for this. So right now I'm going to throw it on my desktop. There's all kinds of stuff on here, but this will be first image to Rhino. And we are going to set this to be either DWG or DXF. I think a DXF works really well. There's a few settings we need in this, so I'll save this. We want to preserve the maximum editability, so we don't need the appearance. We're going to keep the editability checked. We're not going to export selected art only. This way everything that's shown here is going to be exported. We don't need to worry about outlining text. There is no text. And the thing we're looking at here is we're setting the scales. 1 inch equals 1 unit. That's going to be important, so as we bring it into Rhino, we keep things exactly the same size. So we'll say OK. Then it's going to jump over to Rhino. So here I'm in Rhino 3D. This is the PC version. We'll look through a few components first, and then we'll jump into how we work with that DXF file. First, you can see here I have lots of different toolbars, and within toolbars I have objects inside of objects inside of objects, right? I think that this is a pretty difficult way to go about generating work in Rhino. What you see here is the command line. The command line lets me enter commands and operate on them. So I can type box, and this lets me make a box in 3D. Here we have the 4 viewports, the top, front, right, and perspective. Using right click, I can pan around in any one of these viewports. In perspective, right click actually orbits. It does not pan. If I hold shift in right click, I pan in my perspective view. Using the scroll wheel of my mouse, I can zoom in and out of any one of these viewports. Left click selects things. In class we looked at dragging from left to right does a solid box, and right to left does a dotted box. We'll look at that again in a second, but first let's make a piece of geometry. Let's go ahead and make a box. In my perspective view, I can simply click and drag. Rhino lets me enter dimensions, so if I said 10, 10, 10, 10, this is now a 10 unit by 10 unit by 10 unit box. I say that because I'm currently set up on a units of feet, and I see that at the bottom. We'll get more on that in a second. Here's a 10 by 10 box. If I drag from left to right, I have to completely contain the box to select it. It turns yellow when it's selected. If I don't completely contain the box, it will not select anything. If I drag from right to left, it's a crossing box, right? So I see that dotted line. If I come anywhere, any geometry inside of that crossing, it will select. So left to right, I have to fully contain. Right to left, I can partially contain, and it will select a piece of geometry. All right, so let's look at a few other panels here. On my left-hand side, I have lots of tools. These are buttons that I can click, right? And I can go in and pick a different line type. There are all kinds of other tabs here that I can come in. I honestly think it's best to learn the commands. There are lots of them, and if I type curve, you can see that there are a handful of types of curves. So we can come in and we'll talk a little bit more about curves we'd like to use. We can do surface, and it shows you all the commands that deal with surfaces. The thing that we looked at today is that if you can think about it, if you can imagine an operation to do to geometry, there's a good chance that's a Rhino command already. On the right here, I have my Properties tab, and below that I have the Layers tab. These are really, really important tabs to be using. Yours might initially be set up so that they're in the same panel, right? I just drag this back. My layers, I can shift it around. I think it's best to pull it out here and then tuck it back in underneath. I think having the Layers tab underneath the object properties is the easiest way to use Rhino. When I do this now, I can click an object, I can see its object properties here in the Properties tab, and I can also control some of the information on the Layers tab below. When I have the box selected here, I can see it's a closed extrusion and it's on the default layer. By clicking this, I can move it to layer 2, 3, 4. This is a way to move between layers and keep your information organized. Now that it's on layer 2, it shows up as purple, and I can turn off the light bulb on layer 2 so that I can hide and show specific pieces of geometry. Similarly, I could lock a layer so I can no longer select objects on a locked layer. Between the Properties and the Layers tab, it's going to really help us keep our information organized, and I think it's important that you're very careful of where we put geometry and information in Rhino. Looking at our viewports here, we can right-click and look at different ways of representing. Right now we're in wireframe, but I can go to shaded. I'm using right-click again to rotate around. I can right-click and go to rendered, which gives us a different appearance, right, in the background. I think shaded is usually the easiest way to work. You don't have to do that in every single viewport. Not all have to be shaded at the same time. And in fact, if I double click perspective, it makes the viewport enlarge, so now it's only perspective I'm seeing. By double clicking again, I return to all 4. You can see here the plan. This would be the front elevation, and this would be the right elevation. We talked in class about how these things kind of align, and they're all related to this box, right? It makes a lot of sense. One thing you see in the background is the grid. The grid is something that we can choose to operate on. So if I type the command grid, I can say show grid, yes or no, show grid axis, show world axis, apply to active viewports, or apply to all viewports. And I click these options to Boolean toggle them. They change from one to the next. So here I've set everything. Typically in Rhino, if you're in a command, you can hit Enter to end the command and accept the changes, or hit Escape to back out of those changes. Let's say that I was drawing a curve, and here in the viewport I'm drawing the curve, and I hit Escape, it undoes everything, doesn't commit any command. If I drag the curve here and then hit Enter, it accepts and ends the command. You can click all of that and then hit Delete. A few other things to look at here at the bottom. We have some toggles. One is ortho. Ortho is a function. Let's double click the top view and I'll draw a line by typing line, enter. I will click. Reading the command line, the prompts it gives you, Rhino asks you for specific information. So what is the start of the line? That would be this point here. Right now, I can draw this line at any vector at any magnitude, right? I can make it big or small, any direction. If I turn ortho on by coming down and clicking it, I can only move up, down, left, and right. And in fact, I can toggle that using F8. F8 is ortho. One other command to look at down here is the O snaps. You can see I have my O snap panel right here. O snaps are object snaps. So if I go to the end, near, midpoint, perpendicular, there's lots of different options on what I might snap to. And this time now I'm dragging that line out and I can snap it to a portion of that box. Right? So here's an endpoint of that box. O snaps are really, really helpful tools. I can repeat the line command by just pressing enter. Hitting enter will repeat whatever command went last. Here's the midpoint of the segment of that box. I can click that and I can click the endpoint of my first line. This is a way to make sure that all of my geometry is carefully aligned. If I don't want to use O snaps, I can disable them here, or I can press this O snap toggle at the bottom right here. All right. I think that's kind of the basics. So let's go ahead and open up that DXF file. So I'll go up to File, Open. I'm not going to save any changes here. On my desktop, I have right at the top, first image to rhino.dxf. Open. When I open these settings, I'm going to import all of this unreferenced stuff. This is fine, not worried about it. I'm not going to use the convert wide polygons to surface. That's going to make like large stroke widths in Illustrator become surfaces in Rhino. We don't want that. Ignoring thickness is fine. We're going to keep our units inches to inches, and we don't need to worry about setting material, layer, and color. We'll say OK. Turning on current layer. So at the time, one layer was turned off. That's not a big deal. You can see that it's imported everything on those layers that were in Illustrator, but all I really care about is, let's see here, we'll turn this one off. Let's talk about this quickly. So I want image 3 layer 1, and to select this layer I need to make sure that I click this little checkbox, or I can double click on a layer, and you can see that checkbox means it's the active layer. I can turn off my other layers here, and in fact if I wanted to I could delete them. The one thing we looked at in class was using this border to make sure that it came in at the right scale. So if I type distance, I can click on the left side and go to the right side, and you can see it's set to 8 inches. I know I've brought it in at the right scale. If for some reason here at the bottom you see that your units are not inches, you need to change them. And we can do that by typing units. In units here I can change my units by selecting feet, inches, millimeters, whatever it needs to be. If I say I wanted to change to feet and said OK, it's going to ask me if I want to scale from inch to feet by scaling what I've already made. I will say no, and my object will stay the exact same size. So then I can do distance, and I can measure again from here to here and see what it is. It's now 8 feet because I'm in the units of feet. I can undo that. Let's go to units and make sure we're still in inches. That's where we want to stay. If you change units, you can scale things to keep things proportionally, but it's always best to measure and double check. All right, let's get rid of some of these layers. So these 2 layers, I can click one, control click another to add it. I can hit the delete button to get rid of that layer. We'll get rid of layer 2. It has a block in it. That's fine. We'll just leave that alone. And we'll keep this border for the time being. I think it's best to rename layers so that they make sense. This is our base layer from AI. Illustrator. This is our border, and I'm going to create a new, this is new trace. The new trace, I can change the color by double clicking on this, the little color swatch. Let's say that I'll use somewhere like red. And I'm going to double click top and start working on tracing the top here. So again, I'll take my grid, I will show grid no axis, and hit enter to accept those commands. Here's the part of the assignment where it takes a little bit of finesse. We're going to be tracing this image with polylines and curves. And in doing that, we're going to kind of simplify and distill the way this is made. By using a series of different lines, we can then offset the lines, the command would be offset, to recreate this as a drawing in Rhino. And ultimately, we will trim, fillet, and extend those lines to kind of remake this transformation. So the first thing I'm going to do is to double click on my new trace layer to make it the active layer. And I'm going to lock my border and my base layer from AI. Those two layers, I can lock them. In class, we looked at polyline, P-O-L line, and a polyline lets me come in and, let's do this. Let's turn off OSnap. We don't need OSnap. I don't want to snap to anything. A polyline lets me come in to make multiple control points in a line, and so I can kind of work on getting this snapped around. Using right click, I can pan. And I will want to bring my lines outside of the border so I can trim them later. Let's see if I can find another one that I want to use as a polyline. Let's say this one. We'll kind of offset it a little bit from itself. And we'll bring it back inside. I can use kind of my control of how I want this to be moving forward to kind of design the curve layout inside. Something like that. The other thing we looked at is the difference between curve and interpolated curve. So if I use a curve, I'll do that over here, I'm snapping vertices and control points, but it's averaging that curve through those vertices. If I hit enter and accept that. If I look at an interpolated curve, that's interp curve, that's the command up here, interp curve. When I click, the curve actually moves through the vertex as I click it. Sometimes you can see I can really have to get in there and put a lot of control points if I really want to control the curve. But there's a huge difference between an interpolated Bezier curve here, or sorry, a curve using this is a Bezier curve, and an interpolated curve. While they still have these control points that look very similar, this one's generated by me clicking the actual lines the curve moves through. I'll click both of these and hit delete, and we'll come back in with an interpolated curve and do some of the line work in here. So we'll come in, can move this one up. And you can see as I make this tight turn, I need to add more vertexes. Something like that. I'm going to draw a curve this way and say that it pulls in and it turns the corner this way and comes down. So I'm redesigning the overall branches of this image, these kind of cracks. Something like that. This one will start over here. Always using enter to repeat the last command. It's a helpful way to move things quickly. And I'm just going to go through a few of these. Obviously, you'd want to take some time and make sure that you do this with a little bit of care so that we can get a really good product out of the other side. You're able to design, as you redraw this stuff, what the pattern and the overlay ultimately look like. All right, and after a few minutes, I have roughly kind of my centerline curves, my average curves, something that I'm looking for to kind of get that base effect of these cracks. You can see most of my curves overlap each other, and that's important because I'll be able to trim them. My suggestion now is that we're going to start doing offsets. And to do that, I'm going to create a new layer that says new trace offset. In doing this, I can always go back and turn off my first trace path and only use my offset. So I'll double click to make this an active layer, and I will come in and set a new color, say purple color like this, and we will use the command offset. When I use offset, I have to set up some parameters. One is the distance. We talked in class that we do not want to be using giant offsets, like 1-inch offsets, half-inch offsets, because this is an 8-inch composition. We don't want something that large. Similarly, if we ended up with 1/64th or 1/32nd inch offsets, using a laser cutter to make these things will probably burn away everything, so we don't want to do that. I'm going to set this up to be, say, 1/8 of an inch. That's 1 divided by 8, and I put the inches symbol and hit enter. And I can tell it that I want to do that on both sides. 1/8 of an inch on both sides means it's a 1/4 inch total, and it asks me to select a curve to offset. So I'll grab this first curve. And you can see I have to now pick a side to offset. And because I have new trace offset as my selected layer, it will automatically make that geometry on the new layer. So there's my purple lines. I hit enter to repeat the command. I want to make sure I'm on both sides, and I'll do this one here. The next one, I'm trying to do kind of larger widths and work my way to smaller widths. So click this curve, both sides, this curve here, both sides. And now I'll want to maybe move to something finer. So I can change my distance to be 1/16th of an inch. And I can come back in and click a curve on both sides and work my way little by little through each of these curves. Both sides. All right, a few minutes later, I think I've got all of my red curves offset on both sides at various different distances. And what that allows me to do is to turn off my new trace, and I can see all my purple lines there. I can click the light bulb for the AI file, and I can see that I have this composition. And now we're going to look at how we trim, extend, and fill it. Let's first start with trim. The command is trim, and I hit enter. It says select cutting objects. Now, I could pick 1 or 2 objects like this and click enter. It says select object to trim. I want this one to trim out. But that would end up taking a real long time. If I drag from left to right, I can get everything in it. In fact, if I drag from right to left, you can see it didn't select my border. And I want to use the border to trim. So I'm going to unlock the border and drag everything again. I'll run the command trim. And because I have everything automatically selected, it knew those would be my cutting objects. So now it asks for an object to trim. I can start by trimming things on the outside. I can click each line individually, or if I drag from right to left, anything this crosses, it will trim. So I can trim all of these to my border. Same down here. I don't want to click the border. I don't want to go over and click the border, but I do want to get close to it. Everything underneath here, and then everything up the left side. If you have to come in and click a few others, that's not a problem. Everything's still yellow, it's selected, it's still able to be trimmed, so I can come in and click portions. You're clicking on the portion you want to trim away. So click through here, click this, and I'm just going to try to clean up all of these intersections. You can see that I used both polylines and curves. It's probably not the best looking. I'd probably want to stick with one or the other. But I'll show you quickly how we can trim up all of these lines. All right, so there was all the trimming. You can see there's a few lines here that aren't, quite how I want them. I obviously don't want to leave these open-ended. So let's look at the extend command. The extend command is the opposite of trimming. I can set up a border, say these 2 lines here, and extend these lines until they run into it. I could then come back in and use trim and trim that spot out. For these lines, let's say that I made this one, I made that one, but I actually want to connect them. I can use the command fillet, F-I-L-L-E-T. I can set a radius that will blend these two curves together. So let's set a radius of 0.25 inches. I can then take my right line, click near the endpoint, and then click somewhere up here, and we'll blend that line into that. Left line, click up here. I'm going to undo. If I ever fillet this line to this side, you can see it was going to try to put a radius here, but it didn't work because the radius is too large. So I have to make sure I click the end I want to keep filleted. Something like that. And there we go. In a few minutes, oh, here's one more. Let's extend to this line. We'll close that off and we'll trim that out. So in a few minutes here, I was able to create my trace layer, offset it, and then kind of tie all of these in so it's one continuous object. It's trimmed at the border. This is important to keep. We want to keep this hierarchy, right? As we start to make transformations, it's important to keep this set aside. So I'm going to make a copy of this composition before I start doing my mirroring and rotating. And to do that, I'm going to select everything, including the border. I'm going to say copy. Copy, then I'm going to ask, it says a point to copy from. I'm going to click my base point, and I'm going to drag to the right. You can see here I don't have ortho turned on, so I can put this wherever I want. I really want to keep ortho so it stays perfectly horizontal, and I'll say 12 inches. By entering a dimension now, I know that this is exactly 12 inches away, and I'll left click to accept and hit enter to end the command. One thing we looked at also was the gumball. This is this little widget here in the middle. I can turn on and off the gumball. The gumball is a tool that lets us move things or rotate things. We don't want to do that right now. But I can also click portions of it and say 2 inches, and it would move exactly 2 inches. The gumball can be really helpful, but it should be done with precision. All right, let's go ahead and lock our border. This way we can't edit it. This is our trace offset. This is our layer 1 offset. I'm going to I'm going to drag from left to right to select all of it. I'm going to use the mirror command and mirror it over our border edge by turning on my O snaps, clicking the endpoint of my border and dragging down. Then I will come back and grab everything again. Remember, my border's locked, so I cannot select it. I will then say mirror. I will click the far left-hand corner here and drag a horizontal, so I'm starting to create that type of transformation we looked at before. I can then grab all of this stuff and set the scale by typing scale, and scale it back up to the upper left corner at a factor of 0.5, half the scale, right? So we've mirrored it, so that doubled it, and then we mirrored it again, so it doubled it in the X and the Y distance, and by setting to half scale, everything shrinks back to be one size here in the middle. The next thing I want to do is to do a transformation where I take this entire mirrored effect and I rotate it on itself. To do that, I'm going to make a new layer and call this layer 2 trace offset. I'll make that my active layer. I can then select all of this stuff, all that purple layer, and right click on my layer and do copy objects to layer. What that does is it will make a perfect copy of this onto this layer, and I'll have 2 layers of it. So let's do that. We'll set a line, a new color here, say maybe blue. And you can see by double clicking I have that as active, and I can turn off my purple layer, revealing the blue layer behind. Let's change the blue to maybe lime green. It's easier to see. So I have 2 copies here. I have my purple layer and my lime green layer. My border is still locked, so I can select all of this stuff. I'm going to use rotate. Obviously right now using the gumball would be a great way to rotate, but I'm first going to rotate. We're going to rotate about this corner. We're going to rotate it 90 degrees, so I type in 90. Now you can see it's moved. So then I want to use the move command and move it from this corner back 8 inches back into the composition. There's my green layer. I can turn on my purple layer, and you can see one on top of the other. I have the ability to kind of control all of this nested hierarchy. So the assignment here is for you to go back to your base image, to simply remake it in Rhino, and then to go through and make the transformations that you were able to get through your image trace by repeating those similar transformations in Rhinoceros. Ultimately, what we'll see is in the example file, we'll see your Illustrator transformation, which is all image traced, vector data, and we'll see a replica attempt done through Rhino. The assignment sheet says that this project is due on Friday, the 8th. We're asking you to go through all of these transformations and keep your Rhino file nice and tidy, keep all of your layers neatly organized, so that on Friday we can actually continue to work and move this stuff from Rhinoceros back to Illustrator. So that'll be coming up soon. I hope this video is a help and encourage you to do these steps, but then try things above and beyond. Rhino is an often convoluted piece of software, but there's only one way to really get to know it, and that's to just try new things. If you can complete this exercise and have all of these examples prepared for Friday, do one more copy and see what else you can come up with. Best of luck.